I figured out a way to beat the NAR settlement. There's a huge loophole that nobody is talking about. August 17, 2024 changed the way that real estate agents buy and sell homes. Before the NAR lawsuit, the real estate industry had a standard 6% commission built into the sale of every home, but now that is effectively gone, meaning that selling a home has become more of a challenge to some realtors because of these changes. But if done correctly, it's actually going to become significantly easier to earn a commission, which I'm going to explain in the video. The National Association of Realtors lost a $418 million lawsuit and made some changes to the rules that control America's housing industry. But I found a way around the two biggest changes. The biggest change is going to eliminate sellers paying a commission to buyers agents, meaning that buyers might have to pay these commissions out of pocket unless you listen to what I have to say. The other big change is you have to sign a buyer broker agreement for every showing that you do. But that is not entirely true. These changes have affected how realtors earn a living, but I found a way around that. My name's Andy Coleman. I've been one of the top real estate agents for years, closing over 800 deals and earning well over $1.6 million in net commission. And since these changes have taken effect, I've been doing better than ever. There is a ton of misinformation and confusion on how these changes are affecting realtors, so I'm gonna break everything down. The whole goal here is to beat the NAR settlement and earn even more money than before. First, let me briefly explain the NAR settlement so you can better understand my systems for getting around it. NAR, which stands for the National Association of Realtors, is one of the largest real estate associations in the entire country. Real estate agents typically join the NAR after getting their license to get the designation realtor. Local MLS associations must adhere to the policies of the NAR, so they make sure that real estate agents follow their code of ethics. Here's where it gets really juicy, because some brokerages have actually decided to leave the NAR, but it doesn't matter because all of the MLSs have adopted their new changes. Here's how it used to work. The listing agent used to meet with the seller and they would negotiate the commission for the buyer's agent and themselves. Since the 1990s, it was standard that the listing agent would get a 6% commission. However, according to the Department of Justice, these commissions were being fixed. In 2019, a class action lawsuit was filed against them, claiming that the buyer's agent commission was not properly being disclosed to the seller of the home. It was also alleged that buyer's agents were steering clients to properties with higher commissions. You see, after the seller agreed to the initial percentage, the listing agent would then decide if they were going to give that to the buyer's agent and how much. Pay very close attention to that, because typically it was a 50-50 split. The listing agent would get half the commission and the buyer's agent would get half the commission. Here's the crazy part and why some people are so upset over these new changes. Before the 1990s, buyer's agents didn't even exist. It was only the listing agent representing the seller. But consumers felt like they were getting taken advantage of, that the listing agents only had the seller's best interest in mind. And frankly, that was true. This led to vulnerable buyers being taken advantage of and exploited. So the buyer's agent was born in the 1990s and the MLS adopted a buyer's agent commission, meaning if the seller of the home agreed to a 6% commission, the listing agent would get 3% and the buyer's agent would get 3% as well. So now that we understand how it used to work, let me explain how it works now after these new policy changes. There's two main changes that happen. The largest change is the removal of the buyer's agent commission from the MLS. So sellers are not allowed to pay buyer's agents directly anymore. Imagine having a job to do, but not knowing what you're going to get paid. Yeah, they really tried to screw over every single agent with that one, but did they really? Home sellers can still pay their listing agents directly, but now buyers have to pay their buyer's agents. Meaning you as a buyer's agent might have to ask your buyer to come out of pocket potentially tens of thousands of dollars just to pay your commission. Whereas before, that came directly from the seller. But since the NAR settlement, almost every single MLS has came out with a new field to get around this. I'll talk about what strategies you can now use because of this, but first, why was this done in the first place? According to the Department of Justice, if the seller isn't paying the buyer's agent directly, that might save them 3% on the sale of their house, which is going to cause prices of homes to slowly start coming down. However, do you think the seller of a home is going to reduce it by 3%, or do you think they're just going to pocket that extra cash? So far, we have not seen any price reductions, and frankly, I thought that was the way it was going to be from the start. But it's worth noting that the seller can still pay a buyer's agent a commission. And the way around this, what the MLS has deemed a seller's concession. So in your local MLSs, you should see a new field that has popped up labeled seller's concession. So now this fee goes to the buyer, and then the buyer decides how much of that fee, if anything, they're going to give to their buyer's agent. It seems pretty complicated, but it's really not, and I found a really cool solution to this. So stay with me here. Buyers can now negotiate directly with their buyer's agent on exactly how much they're gonna make before you even step foot inside the house of a showing. Meaning they could, in theory, say that I wanna keep an extra 1% for myself instead of giving it to you, which sounds great for the buyer and bad for you, but there's a catch. If the seller decides against paying a seller's concession, you can now demand that the buyer pay your entire commission directly out of pocket. That's partly what I was referring to before about being easier to earn a commission, but there's something even bigger that's gonna blow your minds. Now, if the seller is not paying what you want, you can simply get it from the buyer. Is the seller only offering a 1% commission? That's okay, because now you can charge the buyer a 2% commission, and there you go. Now you just earned your 3%. Yes, the buyer may have to come out of pocket a few $1,000s, but I have a solution to this as well, which is gonna surprise you. First, I wanna talk about the other major change that you've never had to do in the past. All buyers must sign a buyer-broker agreement before ever stepping foot inside the door. And this is mandatory for every single agent unless agents do what I'm about to tell them. That's right, I found a loophole against the dreaded buyer-broker agreement. So if you don't do what I'm about to tell you, you do have to sign a legally binding document every time you go and do a showing with a buyer, which is called a buyer's broker's agreement. This agreement is gonna stipulate how much you're getting paid as the buyer's agent and if the buyer's agreement is actually exclusive or not, meaning if they can work with other agents. Now, this can all be negotiated, keep in mind, but one thing is certain. It's not gonna be as easy as calling the buyer up and the seller and saying, what's the showing instructions, and going and showing the home. Those days are long gone, unless you do this. So if you're working with a renter, then you do not need to sign any buyer brokerage agreements. Yes, you heard that correctly. If you're working on a rental deal and showing a renter a property, according to the NAR settlement, you do not need to sign any kind of agreement at all. You can still go and show the house just like you did before August 17th. And you could also get your commission directly from the landlord, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. So if your brokerage is making you sign a tenant broker agreement, ask them why. No MLS is actually going to require it, so why do you have to sign one? Now listen, these policies can change in the future, but as of right now, there is no such thing as a mandatory tenant broker agreement. So if you want a solution around this entire mess, the answer is easy. Just start working with renters. And before you start saying something silly like, you can't make any money working with renters, I got news for you. I'm making about $2,000 average per rental deal, and I can make $500,000 a year by working with renters. So if you thought working with renters was a waste of time, think again. I'm also gonna give you my new strategy that I use to work with buyers post NAR settlement, but first, let me explain my brilliant rental strategy. Here's what I'm doing to consistently close dozens of deals every single month, sometimes making over $50,000 in commission. Go on your MLS and find a rental listing that you wanna advertise. If you don't have something built into your MLS called Any Broker Advertise or Advertising Allowed, then simply reach out to the listing agent of the property and ask them for permission. Once they give you permission to advertise that property, all you have to do is go on a site like Facebook Marketplace and start marketing it. This is completely free, by the way, so if you do this correctly, you can start getting up to hundreds of leads every single day. The leads will start messaging you, asking you if the place is still available. All you have to do is respond back to them and set up a showing for that property. If the showing works out, then that's fine. Just get the rental package together, start writing up an offer for that property, but if the showing does not work out, then you could set them up in your MLS and get them as a client. I'm sure all of you know how to do a rental deal, but if you don't, I'm gonna leave a link at the end of the video, which is gonna explain the entire rental process start to finish. So just click on that. Okay, so as promised, let me talk about what to do once you get a buyer post NAR settlement, because my strategy is very efficient. We've already established that you have to sign a buyer broker agreement before you do a showing, so let me explain exactly how I do it now to get every single buyer to sign without question. First, before you see a home, find out if the seller is paying a concession. If the seller is paying a concession, great, just put that amount on the buyer broker agreement, but if the seller is not paying a concession, figure out how much you want to charge the buyer directly. And I have a cool trick to use if the buyer doesn't have the money to pay out of pocket. All you have to do is reach out to your lender and see if they can wrap that into the loan. Yes, it's going to be slightly more expensive for the monthly payment, but they're barely going to notice it. Or if the seller is not offering a concession, you could actually negotiate that into your offer. See, the way it works now is the buyer is actually going to credit you at the closing. So that's how you're going to get paid your commission. Or it still could come from the listing brokerage, but every brokerage has their own policies now, so just check beforehand. And then figure out if you want this agreement exclusive. I recommend against that, let them work with whoever they want. Don't try to trap them into working with you. Provide a lot of value and they will stay very loyal to you. If you treat them right and are honest and open and give them all the facts and guide them along, they're gonna be more than happy to sign this agreement and work with you continuously. And I always put a little note in my buyer's agreement saying that if the buyer is not happy with the commission being offered by the seller, they could always back out of this agreement. And that leads me to my next point. These agreements can be amended. So if the seller is offering, let's let's say 2.5%, but you put down 3% on the agreement, you can simply go back in and change it to 2.5%, meaning the buyer does not have to come out of pocket a 0.5%. So as a buyer's agent moving forward, I would always negotiate my commission with the listing agent to try to get the seller to pay it. This way the buyer's not going to have to pay anything out of pocket. From my experience, that is exactly how it's working right now. Most sellers are still paying commissions. Now, there's other tricks that you can start using, like you can charge a flat rate to represent a buyer, or you can charge an hourly rate as well to do showings or write up contracts, any kind of work like that. Maybe you want to charge $50 to write up an offer or $300 for a showing. Believe it or not, the plaintiff Sitzer for the NAR settlement actually created a company and is doing exactly that right now. If anybody's curious, I'll drop a link in the description to that article so you can see how mind-blowing that actually is. Personally, I'm not going to have anything to do with that. I'm just going to charge a normal commission just like I always have. And if you let the buyer know that they could always amend that agreement, they're going to feel really confident in working with you, knowing that you have their best interest in mind. So what about if you're a listing agent representing a seller post NAR settlement? First, sit down with your seller and find out how serious they are about selling their house. See if they have any opinions on this NAR settlement and if they have any objections to paying a buyer's agent a commission by way of a buyer's concession. But first, start with how much you're going to get paid. And just remember, it's no longer 6% anymore. So if you want to keep it the way it used to be, now you're going to ask for 3% for yourself, the listing agent. And then decide on how much you want to pay the buyer's agent. If the seller doesn't have any objections to paying the buyer's agent, then great. Negotiate it right then and there. So this way, when offers come in, you know exactly what the buyer's agents are going to get in the form of a seller's concession. This just makes things a lot easier, and this way when buyer's agents reach out to you and have questions about the commissions, you can answer them. Now keep two things in mind. The seller cannot pay the buyer's agent directly anymore, so that's why it's called a seller's concession. And if the seller chooses not to pay a commission, it could become a lot more difficult to sell the house. If competing properties offer these seller's concessions, but yours doesn't, your property might sit on the market for a lot longer and you might lose potential buyers. So if you're worried about losing potential buyers, all you have to do is offer the standard 2.5%, 3% commission or whatever you want. And this way it's the same as it was before. Just remember, it's not going to be 5% or 6% like it was in the past. Yes, sellers can save money if they do not pay the buyer's agent concession, but how many buyers are actually going to be able to afford to pay these concessions out of pocket? It is extremely difficult just to buy a house as it is right now. Do you really want to be adding an extra $10,000 or $20,000 expense onto your buyer's costs? So far, using these strategies, it has never been easier to be a real estate agent. In my opinion, these changes are actually a blessing in disguise. All the agents that had no clue what they were doing, they're being weeded out right now, meaning there's less competition for you and me, the good agents. Meaning we're going to have an easier time working with buyers, we're going to have an easier time getting listings, and especially above all, it's a renter's market, so we're going to have an easier time working with renters. Because remember, the NAR settlement has nothing to do with renters at all, so it's just business as usual if you're working with tenants. And if you do decide to work with tenants, this video means absolutely nothing at all if you don't click on this video above.